Welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Story Seller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Art Cultural Center. Excuse me. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Bookend programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, March 11th, 2023 at 11:30 a.m. via Zoom, and will feature Matt Goldman, author of Carolina Moonset. This month, we welcome back Marcie Rendon, who will talk about her most recent book, Sinister Graves, a Cash Blackbear mystery.
Yes.
So her first two books, if you haven't read them yet, are amazing. And I am so looking forward to reading this book. Didn't get a copy because they're up in Wadena. All the copies in the library are out. They have 9 copies in a waiting list. So people are loving your books. And I'm like 5th online, so I cannot wait to read it. But welcome back to Bookends, and let's get started. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Where do I start?
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about this latest book?
So Sinister Graves, if you haven't read it, this is the cover. It's published by Soho Press, came out October 11th, 2022. And it starts with, with the spring flood of the Red River, and a body washes into the town of Ada. And of course, Cash Blackbear is called by Wheaton to help figure out who this woman is, how she was killed, how she ended up floating into the town. And as Cash is trying to figure out who this woman is, where she came from, she also discovers 2 small graves outside of a church that's sort of outside of Twin Valley in Monoman, in that, on the prairie out there. So that's the, like the basic kind of outline of the story, or the beginning of it. People always tell me not to say any spoilers, so it's kind of hard to know what to say. But so that's the background of the story, or the synopsis of the story. The idea for the story actually started 15-20 years ago. I was driving through the mountains out in Idaho with some friends, and there was nothing. There was, like nothing in the area. No towns, no gas stations, no bathrooms, nothing. And so we pulled off. We saw this grassy sort of patch, and we pulled off the road. And when we got out of the car, we found out that this was a graveyard. And one half of the graveyard had Native American names, like Chasing Horse or Yellow Medicine. I forget what some of the names were. And so we were walking around looking at these graves. And then I walked over to the other side of the graveyard, and they were all European names: Johnson, Thompson, Smith. And there was one grave where it was a mother and father, and then small graves. And I can't remember if it was 3 or 5 graves, but each child had died when they were 2 years old. And I called the people I was with. I said, come look at this. This is weird. And they said, well, maybe it was the flu pandemic. I said, no, if it was the pandemic, wrong years for one thing, and they would have all died around the same time. They wouldn't have all just died at 2 years old. And it just weighed on me. And I just kept thinking about like the isolation of the area and the stories that you hear about immigrant people coming from Europe, coming to the, like the vastness of what was the United States at the time. And in their minds, there was nothing here. And so many stories of immigrant women getting depression, going crazy, having nervous breakdowns. And I just started to think about postpartum depression. And all kinds of things can happen. You guys know this if you live rural. All kinds of things can happen in rural communities with isolation and people not wanting to talk about things. So anyways, this is all running around in my mind, And then a couple years after that, down here in the Twin Cities, there was a young mother who, with postpartum depression, threw two of her babies off a bridge in St. Paul. And it was postpartum depression, and so those two things kind of, they're just, my brain is super active as a writer. And all of that stuff was running through my brain. And so I sat down to, after I'd finished Girl Gone Missing, which was the second book in the Cash Blackbear series, I sat down to write what would be the third book. And those graves just are what laid the foundation for the story that finally developed. So it's interesting to me that something that happened 15, 20 years ago still was feeding my imagination, and I was able to use it to write the book. And then the book, even though it wasn't released until 2022, I wrote the book pre-COVID. It was finished. But I was switching publishers. I'd gotten an agent. Things were shifting in my writing life. And so even though the book was finished, it wasn't being published until later. And in the meantime, I'm not sure that everybody's aware of the graves of Native children that have been found around the boarding schools. I think it's up to 5,000 plus graves now. But I had written this book before then. And even though the graves in this book are found outside a church, it's not a boarding school story. Yeah. That's kind of, that's that, how that came about.
Yeah. There seems to be like a lot of stories in the news, especially about Native American women and girls and children going missing and stuff like that. Does this deal with some of that? Because I know the other one was women gone missing.
Well, in Girl Gone Missing, it really was about the trafficking of young white women from the farm country in the Minnesota and the Midwest. But yes, there's a huge number of Native American women that are missing or murdered, and it's a big issue across the continent, both in Canada and the United States. I think that currently there are 5 young people just in the town of Bemidji, Minnesota, that are currently missing. If you look at the statistics for Rapid City, South Dakota, it seems like on any given day, there's somewhere between 7 or 12 Native people who are missing. And, there's been this history of oppression against Native people. But there's also this kind of belief that we really don't exist anymore. they were all killed off during the wars, or, it's kind of like where dances with wolves kind of thing. Oh, that happened a long time ago. And so it's easier, I think, to make a people disappear if you don't even know that they're around.
Right.
Just nobody pays attention. Well, nobody pays attention. And yeah, with the Kamloops, British Columbia was the first place where, like, in I want to say in 2022, maybe 2025, somewhere around there, Canada had a truth and reconciliation process where they looked at the abuses that happened in the boarding schools against Native people. And Native people at this Truth and Reconciliation convention, or whatever it was called, that happened in Ottawa, people talked about the children getting killed, children getting buried, but there was no investigation of it. So it wasn't until 2020, 2021, where they used this ground seeking sonar in Kamloops, and they found, I can't remember right now, 500 to 700 graves of Native children around that boarding school. And since then, they've gone to other boarding schools with the ground seeking sonar and looked for graves around these different boarding schools. Here in the so that's happened up in Canada. The same movement hasn't happened here in the United States. There are young people who were killed or died at Carlisle boarding school, and their bodies were repatriated, brought back home after all this hit the news, brought back to different communities in Rosebud and Pine Ridge in South Dakota. But the same looking to see how many graves are actually around some of the boarding schools in the United States, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, we're not real good with being honest about our true past. We like to believe it was all Thanksgivings and happy days.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the worst part is too that so many of these children were forced to go, that it was part of the larger plan to eliminate indigenous peoples by assimilating their children, making them forget their culture, their language, their families, their history.
Correct.
And try to make them white.
Yep. Yep.
Sad. Boy. But it makes for great mystery writing using.
Well, it wasn't, none of that was on my mind when I was writing the book. I was just thinking about those graves in Idaho and, women who live in isolated communities, rural communities, and how hard it is on people. And so I was thinking about that, but I was also thinking about, and I don't intend to offend people at all. But I was thinking about how the institution of Christianity had such a devastating effect on many, many Native people and communities. And that goes all the way back to, Columbus's time, when the papal bull declared that Spaniards and English had the right to all land that wasn't settled, and it laid the foundation for manifest destiny and basically okayed the destruction of Native, when you talked about forced assimilation and taking kids, it was this papal bull decree that actually said this is okay to do. And so it wasn't like individual people, but it was like this overall system. And the book touches on that.
Cool. You said something about switching publishers, and I know like you started out, you know, writing, and so do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that seems sort of interesting, the business life of the writer, you know, because you write it's like first you have to write these books, but then in order for people to read them, you have to get them into people's hands. So you want
Correct.
to talk a little bit about that?
So the first book that I wrote was Murder on the Red River. And it's set, all of them are set in the Red River Valley with the bordering reservations of White Earth, Leech Lake, Red Lake. In Girl Gone Missing, she actually goes over to, or in Sinister Graves, she actually goes over to Turtle Mountain, I think it is. God, I can't even remember what I write, you know. But anyway, it's the business of writing. So I had written, I knew that I wanted to write crime. And so I have 3 books in my garage that are really poorly written. They're my first attempts at writing novels. It was, and I knew they were bad, you know, but I couldn't. So then I gave up. And I said, well, I'll just write, you know, a fluff novel. And so I was going to write a story about a young girl who goes to Nashville and breaks into the music industry. And when I sat down to write that, this character, Cash Blackbear, like literally kind of like she's over here saying, oh, no, no, no. And this whole other story started to come out of me. And that was the book Murder on the Red River. And I've always been part of a writing group. And so I'd share my writing with the other people in the group, and they'd say, this is it. This is the one that's gonna, you know, make it for you. And so you know, the book was written and I sent it to agents, I sent it to publishers for 5 years. And it was just rejection after rejection after rejection. And this was, at that time, the native writers were Sherman Alexie and Louise Erdrich. And I wasn't Sherman Alexie, and I'm not like a literary writer in the same way that Louise Erdrich is. And my book was not, the other thing that was getting published was native romances, you know, the ones on the cover where it's a half breed and like, you know, and that's not what I was writing either.
No.
And so it was just rejection, rejection, rejection. And I was talking to my friend Debbie Reese. She writes a blog called Native Americans in Children's Literature. And she critiques children's literature that has anything to do with Indians. And I was talking to her, and she said, well, why don't you try Cinco Puntos Press? They've published a couple other Native authors, and maybe, you know, it's worth a shot. And she gave me their email. I emailed them. They said they wanted to see the manuscript. I sent it to them. They asked for a revision of the manuscript with the murder like right on the first page, but I'd already done that. So I sent that to them. And then I get an email back that says, we really like the first version better. Here's a contract. And so that's how I got my first, you know, they were first published by Cinco Puntos Press, small independent publisher out of El Paso, Texas. So they published Murder on the Red River. I'd already written Girl Gone Missing. So they had, you know, that came out next. And then I wrote Sinister Graves. But when I had Sinister Graves written, it was like right before COVID. Cinco Puntos was running into, and like many, many small publishers running into difficulties during COVID. And they sold to Lee and Low Publishers, which is a New York publisher of children's literature, people of color writers. But my books aren't children's books. They're crime novels.
Very much so.
And in the meantime, I had, I was still trying to find an agent. And Jackie Lipton, she had her own agency at the time, Ravenquill Agency. She took me on and she pitched, and people were telling me, so I got the rights back to Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing. But people were telling me there's no publisher will pick up an already published series. And I was like, well, okay. So maybe Sinister Graves will just be published sort of like as a standalone novel. But Jackie talked to Soho Press and they picked up all 3 books. And at that time, Murder on the Red River had been picked as one book, one read Minnesota. So like libraries across the state were promoting Murder on the Red River as, book for book clubs to read. And so Soho did a rush printing of Murder on the Red River so that it would be available to people within the state. And then right around that same time, St. Kate's University down here in the cities promoted Girl Gone Missing as one book, one read for St. Kate's University. And so again, Soho did like sort of a rush publication for that book to come out. So, I mean, this is like the whole long story, and then, so then in October, Sinister Graves came out, and it's the first time that I've had a book in hardcover, one of the novels. They've always been paperback before. And so people are still waiting for the paperback of Sinister Graves to come out.
Yeah. Do they still take it like basically from being a bookseller? It would always be like a hardcover would come out and then you'd have to wait a year unless it was something weird like The Help, where it became a bestseller and stayed there, and then they just cashed in by leaving it in hardcover for 2-3 years.
I don't know.
But that is great, because that really means that in a way you've arrived when they start investing in publishing hardcovers of your book.
Right.
That always told me, okay, this author they believe in, because if it's just like, oh, here's a paperback, we'll see if you like it or not. It's, but
Right.
it costs a lot of money, and it means that, and I think it's really says something too when you have to wait a really long time to get it out of the library as well, that you're getting that audience you deserve. So
right.
congratulations on that.
Thank you. Sinister Graves is shortlisted. It's as one of 4 books that have been put forward for the Minnesota Book Award.
Awesome.
So we won't know until May whether it will actually win the award or not, because there's 3 other very good authors who also have books nominated. But those things make a difference.
Yeah.
I know that it's out in Audible. All 3 books are out in Audible now. And the reader for Sinister Graves is a young Dakota woman from here, Isabella LeBlanc. She's an actress. She's been in different theater shows, and she's been on some, walk-on roles on television. And was just in Iceland shooting some show for television that I guess will be a series. So that's exciting that she's the one that actually got to read Sinister Graves for us.
Cool. So it sounds like things are really going well.
Yeah. Yes.
That is so great. Do you think you could read a little bit of the book for us?
I can.
Awesome.
Again, I try to avoid spoilers. So I will just read from let's see. Yeah, I'll just read from the beginning of the book rather than going too far in. Okay. Cash sat in a battered fishing boat on murky flood water that was headed to the Red River. The spring flood covered the valley as far to the east and west as she could see. Schools had closed. No one could get to church to pray. The prehistoric glacial Lake Agassiz existed once again. What had been plowed fields of wheat and corn, soybeans and oats, potatoes and sugar beets were now an ice-cold snowmelt lake 60 miles wide from one side of the valley to the other. And then I'll skip ahead a bit. Well, maybe I shouldn't. Anyways, I'll go back. I'll just keep reading here. Cash took a break from oaring, removed a mitten, and dipped her hand in the frigid water. If you got caught in the floodwaters, the freezing temperatures would kill you as faster than the rushing water. She quickly pulled her hand back out, cupped it near her mouth, and blew warm air over her fingers. Even bundled up in a winter jacket, scarf, mittens, and a stocking cap pulled low over her ears, she still shivered in the cold. Al, a friend of one of the regular drinkers at the Casbah bar, was sitting in the rear of the boat. Cash carefully turned around on the seat so she was facing him. He wasn't bad looking. His hair wasn't as long as a hippie's, but not a short farmer buzz either. His skin said Indian. Cash guessed he was a Vietnam vet. As Al navigated the floodwaters, he would either drop the small motor into the water to move them along faster, or bring the motor up when the water was too shallow. At that point, he would oar with her. Just a week ago, the Red River Valley had been snow-covered. It had been a long winter with whiteout snowstorms that left 4-foot road drifts and piles of snow taller than the haystacks in the fields. Then there was one day warm enough for snow melt. That's all it took. One day in the valley at 40 degrees, followed by 3 more days with temperatures that didn't drop below freezing. The Wild Rice River, with its headwaters on the far eastern shore of the ancient Lake Agassiz, carried the snowmelt down into the valley. When the Wild Rice, along with 100 other small tributaries, rapidly flooded their banks, all the water moved in a murky rush to spill across the fields of the valley, the farms and towns, to join the mighty red snake that ran to the north. Farmers scrambled to sandbag their barns to keep their cows safe before moving to bag their own homes. They rode tractors into town to fill more bags to lay around the perimeters of the small towns. The huge tractor tires kept their bodies safe above the floodwaters. Cash spent 11 hours the day before throwing sandbags with a chain of humans. One end filled bags with sand, then 10 to 15 people passed the full bags to those at the end of the line. They laid sandbags like bricks to create a dike in order to keep the river from flooding downtown Fargo. It was a rush against the forces of nature. It happened almost every year with the snowmelt. The only questions were ever asked were how high would the water rise and how long would it stay? This year was one for the records. When Cash had arrived home after helping fill sandbags, she was so bone weary she flopped into bed without getting undressed and didn't wake until the incessant ringing of her landline woke her. No one except Wheaton ever called. What few friends she had given up her ever answering her phone. Most just dropped by or hollered up at her apartment, or made the journey up the flight of stairs and knocked. But that early morning phone call rang and rang. It stopped briefly, then started ringing again. Cash finally pulled herself off the bed and stumbled to the kitchen. She picked up the handset. Yeah? Cash, it's Wheaton. What are you doing? Sleeping. There's a flood out there. Silence. What? We have a body that floated into town. Silence. Where? Ada. Highway 75 is flooded. I don't even know if I can get over to Moorhead. Last night they were saying the river might crest over the bridges in downtown. Maybe someone's got a boat that could get you out here. More silence. You'd have to follow the road up. Stay away from the river. River's going too fast to try and get on. Maybe a boat with a motor could get you up Highway 75. Or 9. 9 might be safer. Water's not as deep and there really is no current. The water is just sitting on the fields, waiting for the river to empty up north. Cash leaned her head against the counter. Her waist-length braids slid over one shoulder. Even though she worked out each week in the judo class at the university, the muscles in her arm holding the phone was sore from moving sandbags all day. She pulled the headset away from her ear and stared at it. Cash? Yeah, okay. She hung up. The phone rang again. Cash? What? You hung up. Are you coming? I said okay. And she hung up again. So that's how it starts.
Cool. Well, I know I'm looking forward to reading it. So do you think that that you're gonna stick with the Cash series?
I'm working on book 4, yes.
Awesome. Because as a reader, once you get attached to a character, you're like, what else happens? So somebody asked what kind of special sense does Cash Blackbear have? Like, does she have some sort of skill or something that makes it?
In all 3 books, she has like an intuitive ability that she uses to help sense different things or help solve some of the crimes or to find some of the people that are, you know, the victims in the stories. I don't think it's, you know, like it's not a paranormal thing. It's not supernatural. I think that every human being is born with an intuitive ability, but for most of us, it's educated out of us. We're just supposed to trust our brain. We're just supposed to think our way through things rather than rely on our instincts or our, you know, these intuitive abilities that I really do think that all young people have. So yeah, she uses intuitive abilities to help solve some of the crimes. I was talking with another group a couple weeks ago, and it was a new realization even to myself that Wheaton never helped solve a crime. Like, he's the county sheriff, but he kind of like ropes Cash in, and she goes off and solves the crime, brings the solution back to him, and I guess he's responsible for like the paperwork or something. But really, she's the one that's, even though he's the sheriff, she's the one doing the solving.
Right. Well, that's sort of interesting because a lot of times when you look deeper, like I like to read a lot of nonfiction as well because I'm curious about the world, and you look deeper and you realize cops don't solve that many crimes. Actually, they have only at the moment they have about a 50% rate, so a lot of stuff just doesn't get solved, and particularly with certain populations, it seems like if you were a beautiful blonde young white girl, you've got everybody on top of that, but all the rest of us is like there's like almost a hierarchy, and people towards the bottom don't really get the attention and resources they need to actually solve these crimes, and then therefore perhaps prevent more.
Right. I have a play that I wrote, Say Their Names, and it's about the missing and murdered Indian women. And we had a staged reading of it over in St. Paul. And one short piece in there, because it's based on fact that there's thousands of missing and murdered Indian women across the continent. And just what you said about some people get a higher priority. But here in the Twin Cities, and it's bad. Recently, we've had a large number of carjackings, you know, or people stealing cars. And like in the winter months, people with leave their car running, and then it would just get stolen. So was maybe about 5, maybe even more cars that got stolen with dogs in them.
Aw.
And everybody in the city was trying to find these cars with dogs in them, and how, helping to rescue the dogs. And at the same time, coming across the news feed are the number of, like there's 3 for sure, 3 young women up in Bemidji that are missing. And are people out walking the streets, look, it's incongruent to me that somehow, and that's not to say that pets aren't important, but human life seems to me would have a higher value or generate more concern among people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
hard to.
yeah, I think the thing, working with animals too and stuff, it's just, I think that with animals, they just seem, there's not a lot of, it's a dog is a dog. Whereas with people, there's all this politic and perception and judgment,
Right,
and
right.
so you're like, well, if it's a person, you can say things like, well, how could they be so stupid, or why didn't they know better, or they
Or
made
they
this
were doing
choice,
drugs, or they were,
or
out at the wrong time of
this,
day. Yeah,
right? What were they wearing, or did they ask for it? But somehow it seems like, oh, but a dog,
right,
you
right,
know, we gotta help. And it's easier because then there's no ambiguity. I think that's like, I think people are just, it just seems like we're not seeing each other as fellow human beings, and we're spending so much time. I think, it's fine to be proud of your heritage and your belief system or whatever it is that you are,
mhm,
but I think we focus so much on labels and categories instead of recognizing it doesn't matter. We're all human. We we're so much more similar than we are different, but we focus so much more on the differences.
correct. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, like and then the same thing too is like, well, if an African American or Native American goes missing, it doesn't seem to generate the same as like that the blonde girl Gabby, whose boyfriend, ended up having killed her and stuff. But when she was missing, suddenly it's like front page news, it's everywhere. And then you realize so many more people go missing, and it's not even in the local papers.
right,
So you
right,
don't even know to look for them because you're not even aware they're missing until the numbers become so large. It's dehumanizing almost. When you say thousands of people,
right.
it's a different thought than one individual.
Yeah.
And it makes it easier for people, I think, to ignore it, which is
Mhm.
sad.
Could I
It's
oh, sorry, I was just gonna see if we could maybe circle back around to the audiobook version. I was curious, did you say that the same narrator has done all 3 books?
No, the first 2 books are by a different narrator, and
Okay,
I apologize, I don't know her name. Um, it's the 3rd book is by Isabella LeBlanc. And I'm a writer.
mhm,
One of the reasons that I work so hard to get, like a publisher rather than self-publishing, and another reason that I work so hard to get an agent is because I just know nothing about this business, the business end of it. And
right,
so Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing, Cinco Puntos, they hired an audio firm or something to find somebody to read the books. And then Soho did the same with Sinister Graves, because the audios were already out for Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing.
okay. So did they consult, did you get consulted on who they chose, or did they seek any of your input on that?
With with the first two books, Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing, Cinco Puntos, the company that did the Audible,
Mhm.
they sent me like 5 clips of different people reading. And I narrowed it down and said, like, I like these two the best. And then I think they picked who the reader was. With Sinister Graves, Soho, everything's by email. Like
Mhm.
they emailed me and said, do you have a recommendation of who you'd like to read? And I know that Isabella LeBlanc read Angeline Bowley's Firekeeper's Daughter. And I've known Isabella since she was a little girl, And so I said, Isabella, why not Isabella? And then I never heard anything more until I got an email from Isabella saying, I just finished the reading for your book. So,
Oh,
so
wow.
happy I was able to do that for you. And I was like, oh, it's like I didn't even know that she was the one that they had, hired to do the reading. So, I mean, if you guys are writers, it's all of these things that I certainly didn't know and really don't even know now, that all play in, like the book covers with Cinco Puntos, we commissioned, or I guess Cinco Puntos commissioned Joe Allen, who lives up at White Earth, to do the covers for those books, the first Cinco Puntos versions. And so his photographs are the covers. Now, when it went to Soho, they created new covers. So these, and I don't even know who the artist is for the covers. But when you look at them, I mean, you can see that they're, they all match in a certain kind of way.
Mhm.
So if you have them on your bookshelf, they all kind of look alike. And with the covers from Soho, they would send me, like, again, 5 versions of the cover in different colors, different, and they would, I would pick which one that I liked, but they ultimately have the final say.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm happy with them. Yeah. But it's that business side that just I haven't been prepared for as much.
I've always been
Yeah.
curious about the relationship between authors and the chosen narrators for the books, because I've read some interesting stories about some of the relationships that sort of developed. One of the early series that I was listening to, I found out years later that the author would start to add characters with more wild accents to see if to listen to the narrator handle it, because she was so amazing at it.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have not. That's not what I've done. That's for sure. Yeah, interesting. It is important. Like, I know that with Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing, there's some Ojibwe words in there, like really few, but that might have actually been a phone call where, like, I would say the word and then
Mhm.
the narrator would say it back to me.
I have run across a couple of audiobooks where a mispronounced name really kind of jerked me out of the story.
Mhm.
And it was mispronounced over and over and over throughout the entire one. And I had to think, well, did the author leave a note that it was actually supposed to be said that way? But anyway, thank you for the information.
Yeah,
Yeah. I also noticed when you were holding up those books, they look thicker. That like perhaps they used a bigger font or different paper. Because I do know I was in Chicago when The Time Traveler's Wife came out, and Audrey Neffenegger was actually into paper
Mhm.
and the paper arts. So she very much was involved in the type of paper the book was printed on. But I noticed that I've had two copies of the same book printed differently, and I'm like, and I go through it and it's all the same stuff, but one just looks thicker than the other,
Yeah.
which I think they do to try to convince people they should buy the books because look, it's, it's a meaty thing.
Yes.
Yeah, I have no idea again about that business end of, which is why there's marketers. Like
Yeah.
with Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing, I didn't pick those titles. I wrote the book. And then
Mhm.
they have publishers have a marketing team. And what Cinco Puntos did was they sent me like 30 titles and I eliminated a bunch. And then they sent me more and we eliminated more. And then I think there was like down to 5. And their marketing person picked the title that they think would sell the best.
Mhm.
So that was and I was fine with that because my things are all untitled, because I don't know how to title anything. The
Really?
Sinister Graves, that's actually a title that I picked. It's what I called the book from the beginning because back to Idaho, that was sinister.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so they use that title, but there's no guarantee that I will even know how to title the next one.
Yeah, that always seems strange to me that authors didn't always pick the titles. And same thing with films. The filmmakers, the people who write films, they might have one title and what it actually ends up being is something completely different.
Right, right. There
Yeah.
was a book, Girl Gone, that was a bestseller.
Oh, Gone
And
Girl.
Girl,
It
what is it? Girl,
was Gone Girl.
Gone Girl. And so there's been like 20 books after that with girl in the title.
Yeah.
And so this is apparently a marketing decision that
Right. Yeah, sometimes marketers are a little lazy, something works. So they're like, let's keep just using this until it doesn't anymore and we have to come up with something new. So just kind of looking to see if anybody had a question.
Yeah,
Does
the
anybody
question.
else have any questions? You can either raise your hand or type it into the chat. If you don't want to say it out loud, I'll read it. I like to open it up for questions. While I'm waiting. So what is your favorite, like when you read, what is your favorite? Because I know you're writing in mystery. Is that like your favorite genre to read as well? Or
I read crime, I read true crime, I read thrillers, psychological thrillers. I like I think my favorite series of all times was the Wallander series. It's a
No.
book that comes out of Sweden. What's the
Ah.
guy's name? Manning Keller, I think. Manning. Should look it up here. I read one book and it's the only series that I ever went online and I ordered every single book by the author and I just read them in the same way that people watch Netflix. And
Yeah.
it is a Netflix series. Which then I watched all the Netflix. So Manning Mancal. That's his name. Henning Mancal. But like John Sanford, Lee Child, John Grisham, the Harry Bosch series. Can't think of who the author is there. Anne Rule, True Crime by Anne Rule. It's like I read like other people watch shows on video or internet or whatever, television.
Mhm.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of them, the thing about mystery is just I think people like that, the suspense, the trying to figure out what's happening and mystery, like if there's something you don't know as a human, you're just like, I gotta figure that out. So
Right.
no, that is really cool. Did you start writing when you were a child? Was this something that you always wanted to do, or did you get into that later? Or
Well, I have always written, but as a young Native person growing up, no one told me that I could be a writer. Like that
yeah.
just, I don't even think that was a, like, it's kind of like the first time I saw a Native woman on stage, I think I was in my 30s. And Margot Kane came down here to the cities from Edmonton, Alberta or something. And she did this performance piece on stage. And I left the theater saying, no one told me we could do this. Like I'd never seen, like a Native woman on stage performing. So like I've written, I started writing as soon as I learned how to write, and always wrote poems, wrote my way through college, so like I did journalism work. I knew that I could write, but I didn't know that I could do this thing.
Right.
And I think that when like Murder on the Red River won the Pinkley Prize for debut crime writer. Um, and one of my thoughts was like, geez, maybe I do know how to do this. like, like it had just never, I loved writing and I just like making stuff up, like making up wild stories, and when I was in grade school, I remember telling the kids that, that Geronimo was my uncle and that me and my mom had canoed down the Mississippi to go visit him. And I just make it all up and make it, and they believed me. That kind of just making stuff up or encountering a situation and then all of a sudden just going off on a whole tangent in my brain. Someone said, how often do I come up to my home reservation? I'm coming up there next weekend. I think it's next weekend. I'm going over to Pine Point and they're having a soup and bread contest. And so I'm going to be one of the judges for that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And then some young women from the school I have a 10-minute play that about why did God create lice? And so they're going to do that play and then I'll read from my book. So maybe a couple times a year I get up that way.
Well, I know you're coming in April.
What am I coming in April? Without looking at my calendar.
Yes, I know you are coming up in April because Becca Dollinger is the one that set it up for me for Lake Agassiz Regional Library.
Oh, right. Yes.
I am
yes.
so
Spending a
looking
whole
forward
week
to
there.
you
Yes.
coming and doing a reading for us.
Yeah. Thank you. It's good to, when I get up that way, it's, how it is when you just, you can feel it in your whole body, like, this is the smell of the trees, the wind. I stepped out of a car in Fargo a couple of years ago and that wind came and I thought, oh, my wind. Hadn't felt it like that in years.
Yeah, I have a friend who says when he drives west to go home to Oregon, he knows he's almost there when he can start to smell the sage. So when he
Yeah.
hits about Wyoming and the sage smell comes back, he starts to feel like, "Oh, all right, I'm home.
Right.
There's sage." So cool. Yeah, and it's good to know that you're getting out and people are seeing you, because I don't think that, like, I think is being sort of part of the mainstream European culture, a lot of us don't realize, because I've heard like Native American people, African American people, Latinas, they've all said sort of, especially like growing up in America, they didn't realize they could do things because they'd never seen themselves. And I don't think a lot of the rest of us really understand. Yeah, for like a lot of people, if you don't see anybody that looks like you or is from your background doing
Mm.
things like whether writing, acting, science, leadership, that it doesn't even enter into their radar that they could. And so I think it's really great when more people get attention and show, yeah, there's more than just Sherma Alexie and Louise Erdrich. Not that they're not great, but there's a lot more men and women who can contribute, and it's nice to, you know, to be able to do different genres, like, you know,
Right.
mystery and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be, oh, and I'm a Native American writing about, like, it's like you happen to have a Native American character and there's things about that in the books, but it still reads like a straight up mystery. Like mystery lovers wouldn't feel like they couldn't enjoy the book or understand what's going on because it's that, you know, it's a
Yeah.
mystery book. It just happens to be with these people instead of these people.
Correct, correct. And that's, like people have asked about some of the harder issues in the books, whether it's women missing or foster care or boarding schools. And it's like, I'm not trying to educate people. I want to write a crime novel that anybody will pick up and read. And if the other stuff is, I can't not write it because that's who I am. That's my history. That's my, my body of knowledge. So that information is in there, but hopefully it's not in there in a way that people are drawn away from the story.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
And
just that because they're set in rural Minnesota, most crime novels are set like in the big cities,
yeah.
and what I've found is that rural people across the continent, both Canada and the United States, are like, oh, wow, I drove beat truck too, or, I know what it's
Yeah.
like to plow a field, and it's so like other people who maybe wouldn't necessarily pick up a native book are reading these books because they're rural based.
Right. And they're mystery, and people love
Yeah,
mystery.
yeah.
That's one of the top selling genres after like romance.
Right.
Um, and also I think too, because I've learned a lot, like if I come across things like when I was younger, especially, like I remember listening to a Pete Townsend song and he used the word ennui and I didn't know what it meant. So I looked it up. And I've
Mm.
read books where they might have mentioned something and in passing because it wasn't absolutely imperative to the plot. It was just there, but it was interesting. So I go on and learn, like I'll be like, oh, I wonder what this is about, or
Mhm.
oh, they're talking about like, oh, it's a fiction novel set during like Tudor England, but I want to know more about like, oh, who are the other wives, or that kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
So sometimes you don't have to take yourself out of the story to fill in more, but by putting it in there, it might lead people who are curious to then find out more.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So cool. Well, it looks like our time is over. It's too bad.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming back, and hopefully we'll see you again on your fourth novel.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's great. And maybe, like Kathy said, I'll see you guys when I'm up that way. I'm sure that the event at Pine Point is open to folks, and and then all the different readings at the libraries when I'm up there next month are obviously open to the public. But thank you so much for having me, and thank you for continuing to promote my work. I appreciate it.